say what a huge honor it is for us at Pardes to be hosting this event together with George Washington University. We are, Daniel has been a long-time faculty member for decades at Pardes, and his impact at Pardes is going to last for decades more, as he has created this wonderful set of curriculum called the Mahloket Matters curriculum. We had 2 fantastic cohorts right now, and there was so much demand of people whose mission it is to learn how to use Torah as a way of bringing people together and to have very difficult conversations together. There's been so much demand that now there's 6 cohorts of Mahloket Matters fellows spreading Daniel's Torah throughout the country and his throughout North America and through Israel. And your work has made an indelible impression on us here at Pardes. So Daniel, thank you so much for everything you've done. We are so excited to be part of this event and to see you going on to make such an impact and to see your work really reaching the whole public. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Professor Eisen to continue.
Thank you, Mish, for those opening words, and welcome everyone to our event today. I'm Robert Eisen, Professor of Religion and Judaic Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking to you from my home in the Washington suburbs. I want to begin by just thanking everyone who's made this event possible. First and foremost, Rabbi Leon Morris and all the folks at the Pardes Institute in Israel who organized this event. I'd also like to thank 2 individuals who agreed to have their respective organizations as co-sponsors for this event. Dr. Erica Brown, Director of the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership at George Washington University, and Dr. Ari Dubnov, Director of the Judaic Studies Program, also at George Washington University. I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker, my good friend Daniel Roth, and with his permission, I'll address him by his first name because he's just Daniel to me. Daniel is from Israel and did all of his higher education in Israel. He holds a bachelor's of education from the Herzog Teachers College, an MA in Talmud from the Hebrew University, rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Har Etzion, and a PhD from Bar-Ilan University in Conflict Management, Resolution, and Negotiation. Currently, Daniel is Director of Mosaica, the Religious Peace Initiative. This is a wonderful organization. It's a network of religious mediators in Israel that works to advance religious peace and to mitigate crisis situations in Israel, particularly between Israelis and Palestinians. In addition to that, Daniel is a core faculty member for various conflict resolution and mediation programs at Bar-Ilan University, Tel Aviv University, and the Hebrew University. In addition to that, he's a senior research fellow at George Mason University's Center for World Religious Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution. That university is here in the Washington area. Daniel is also the founder and director of the Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution, which Mish was speaking about. And finally, he's a regular lecturer for Mejdi Tours, which runs educational tours about conflict situations throughout the world. Last but not least, Daniel has written a book, right? That's what this event is about, entitled Third-Party Peacemakers in Judaism, Text Theory and Practice. The book has just been published by Oxford University Press. In fact, I just received my copy in the mail yesterday after talking to Daniel. That's going to be the subject of today's talk. Let me just add that as impressive as this bio sounds, I don't think it adequately reflects just how important Daniel has become in the field of Judaism and conflict resolution. The academic work he's doing in this field is groundbreaking. This is a relatively young field, a relatively new field, and he is a pioneer in it. And Daniel, you should know, does the kind of research that requires knowledge and textual skills that few academics have. I can vouch for that. In addition, Daniel has become incredibly important as a practitioner of conflict resolution. In Israel, he's become one of the key figures in negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians on religious issues. Now, your flyer says that the format here will be one of dialogue between Daniel and myself, but after some discussion with Daniel, we've decided to adopt a more traditional format. Daniel's going to speak for 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll then open things up to questions. The flyer did not specify an end time for the event, but I think we'll allow for 40 to 45 minutes or so for questions, so that we should wrap things up in just a little bit over an hour from now, about 2:15 p.m. East Coast time in the US. Now, the reason we're doing the format in this way is that a dialogue between Daniel and myself would be, well, in some ways superfluous. Daniel and I have been in constant dialogue for many years. It's been one of the great pleasures of my academic work to, hear all and read his stuff. And I think that any questions that I've had about his work or any insights I've had about it, as meager as they are, well, I think I've already offered them, and they're accounted for in Daniel's work. And so I don't really have anything to offer today more than I already have. And it really, I think, would be best if Daniel has the floor and is able to present his own work. So without further delay, I present Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth.
Thank you so much, Mish. And of course, to the Pardes Institute for hosting this event, and to George Washington University for co-sponsoring it. And Rob, what can I say? Yes, if it was not for your, what we call chavruta, your study partnering and going over every line of the book beforehand and encouraging me to write the book in the first place, we would not be here right now. So I can't thank you enough. So I have a tall order of trying to tell a story that took about 15 years and is over about 370 pages in about 35 minutes. But what I'm going to try to do is to break up this time into three main parts. I want to give a little bit of the background behind the book, an overview of the book, and then take two case studies of the 36 that I write about that I think are particularly relevant to this evening's events in the news. And I will leave that for you to imagine what I might be referring to briefly. And then we'll open it up for questions. So I want to start with the story behind the book, okay? Preface. It's 2003, the middle of the Second Intifada, and I am spending my time over ancient Talmudic manuscripts and learning Greek. And I'm asking myself, how is this affecting the reality that is around me? And after finishing that degree at the Hebrew Talmud department, which no one had really heard of until the fantastic movie Footnote came out, I signed up to do a PhD in conflict resolution at Bar-Ilan University, because it was one of the only universities at the time that had an appreciation for integrating religion with conflict resolution studies. After searching a bit for different topics, I came across one of the foundational books of the field of religion and peace building by Mark Gopin, Eden, and Armageddon. And there was just a couple of pages in that book that I remember reading and saying, I think it'd be a lot more that could be said about that one topic, which was about the role of rabbis and the role of third-party religious peacemakers in Judaism. And Mark brought two cases that were very, very important. And a lot of my research since then is, what more can we learn about this? So I went ahead and did my PhD about Aaron, the pursuer of peace. And as I'm about to hand in my PhD, which was really focused about third party, but also about reconciliation processes in Judaism, comparing it to Islamic models and Western models, I come across the research of my good friend, my now good friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Howard Kaminsky. I almost had a heart attack because I am finishing my PhD, and then I come across the research about Judaism and conflict resolution that had just come out. I didn't know about it. the short version of the story is the two Jews that wrote about Jewish conflict resolution are good friends, because he wrote about every type of conflict when there is no third-party mediator, and I wrote about third-party mediators. So we were able to reconcile that, but it did mean having to shift when Rob, you had encouraged me to do a book about the idea, which seemed kind of crazy, to have to do about 50% new research for my PhD and leave about 50%. Along the time that I'm doing my research, and even beforehand, I'd been teaching at Pardes, as Misha mentioned, for about 20 years. And as my own thinking of how to integrate the theories and practices of conflict resolution with Jewish text, Pardes was so gracious that they kept on opening up new infrastructure and new programs, from a class to a Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution, to what morphed into being Mahloket Matters that Misha had mentioned, of how to use text to help people learn how to disagree more constructively today. And then a couple years ago, right as I'm finishing up the book, the research of the book, I transitioned to being at Mosaica and having the opportunity to work with really what I believe is to be, if not the number one third-party peacemaker, certainly one of them, Rabbi Michael Malkior, who said, come and stop just writing about it and teaching about it and theorizing about it. Come with me and let's do it together in the Middle East. And that's been an incredible experience. So really the book, Third-Party Peacemakers in Judaism, when I say text, theory, practice, it's literally goes deep into the world of Talmud, into the world of text, into the world of Jewish history, and trying to uncover a lot of texts that had never been addressed before, connecting them into the theoretical world of conflict resolution studies, which I'll explain in a moment. And then constantly at the end of each section, each 36 case studies that I write about, what are the implications for practice today? How do I apply that? So what I want to do briefly is do a quick overview of some of the chapters, and then, as I said, go into depth onto two stories. So the first chapter I called From Muhammad to Sulha, Religious and Traditional Cultural Models of Third-Party Peacemaking. And the argument here is that each religious tradition has their role models of who is their paradigmatic peacemaker. And if you look at the literature about Islam and conflict resolution, if you look at educational programs about Islam and peace building, you'll always have it start with Muhammad the Prophet serving as the paradigmatic mediator and peacemaker. Or in Christianity and conflict resolution and peace building, we'll always talk about emulating Jesus as the peacemaker. Excuse me. At the same time, as there's a field of religious peace building, okay, that looks at the text and looks at the practice of religions and peace, there's also a whole world in the academic studies of traditional conflict resolution or culture and conflict resolution. And that's coming more from the world of anthropology, of what are some of the non-Western, non-modern models of third-party mediation, reconciliation, conflict resolution. The leopard skin chief was one of the earliest that was written about, saying, my goodness, this is a whole other type of mediation, a whole other type of conflict resolution that's very different than modern contemporary Western models. The Jirga process in Pakistan, I write about. And how do those compare and contrast to Western models of reconciliation and third-party peacemaking? And of course, the Sulha process, the Arab-Islamic process, which is perhaps the most researched and well-documented. So taking these two different theoretical models, meaning the textual religious traditions of paradigmatic peacemakers and the researched anthropological research on cultures that have been serving as mediators, I wanted to have that as a lens through which we could analyze what happens within Jewish text, what happens within Jewish tradition. So the next few chapters are basically going from case study to case study. And the first of those is chapter 2, where I go deeper and deeper into the world of Aaron as a paradigmatic peacemaker. This isn't historical. This is a legend that has invited literally 1,500 years of interpretation and more commentaries, each one giving their wisdom about how someone should be trying to make peace. Of course, the story of Aaron serving as the one who reconciles two parties that are in conflict until they're able to embrace. How does that compare to non-Western models, to Western models? And the whole time, again, I've had the opportunity, especially at Pardes, to use a lot of these texts, to teach them over, training rabbis, training educators, training practitioners. What are the implications? What works? And I share a lot of stories of things that flopped and that didn't work. And of course, comparing it to other cultural models, such as the saints of the Atlas Mountains, that very similar to Aaron, where like the high priest, they're mediating between God and the people, and they're also charged as being the peacemakers, very similarly to how the rabbis imagine Aaron doing so. So that is the classic rabbinic literature, but also goes all the way through history of how people interpreted these core paradigmatic stories and legends of Aaron. The next chapter, chapter 3, I want to go beyond Aaron, staying within classic rabbinic literature, which is again what we would call the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, 2nd to 5th century, more or less. Who are some of the other stories that are found in this legend literature that are described as being third-party mediators or third-party peacemakers? Rabbi Meir is seen as being a highly respected mediator, similar to Aaron. But there's also stories of, let's say, the simple jesters, simple people that the Talmud describes, that these people get a portion of the world to come because they are serving and working hard to make peace between people. A totally different model than what we see with Aaron, who's a highly respected, the one and only high priest, but also simple people can be engaging in this. The story of finding women who are involved in this, really, really hard, because the texts are written by men, for men, and men are generally in traditional societies the ones serving as mediators. But nevertheless, trying to find a couple of legends that tell how women served as peacemakers, very similar to how the theoretical academic literature today describes how women serve as peacemakers within religious and traditional societies. And again, also within this chapter, at the end of each case study, reflection on practice, practice, practice. What do we do with these texts? How can this actually affect the world that is around us in training young people or religious leaders as well? The next two chapters, I move from being in what's more well known of the classic rabbinic literature of the Talmud to being medieval and early modern rabbinic literature. And here I'm transitioning from legend literature to more historical accounts. People that some of them are famous, many of them are not. I start off this chapter with Rabbi Yossi Syracuse. Those who know me know that I'm originally from Syracuse, New York. So when I found that there's a peacemaker named Rabbi Yossi Syracuse, I'm like, I've got to write about him. But Rabbi Yossi Syracuse was the first rabbi to come to Safed, to Tzfat in the Galilee, and he was well known for also making peace amongst the non-Jews, amongst the Muslims of Tzfat. And it becomes a very important precedent for it is a commandment to also make peace not only within the Jewish community. There, I write about legends of the great yeshiva of Volozhin in the 19th century, of who were the mediators who stepped in when there was a conflict. Those of you who have ever heard me start getting really excited know that my hero of the book is really the Chida, Rabbi Chaim David Levi Azulai, who was a great rabbinic authority in the 18th century, and he had a diary that he literally is telling how he would go ahead and mediate and pursue peace in all sorts of conflicts, sharing his inner thoughts with us. There's so much richness that can be learned from these texts. And again, constant implications for practice. And when I mean practice here, especially in this chapter about religious leaders, I'm not only talking about training people, also what works and what doesn't work. My work that I get to do today with Mosaica of trying to connect rabbis with sheikhs to actually try to solve problems and reconcile relationships. How is that inspired from these different models? What can we learn from these deeply cultural religious models to then infuse the right type of wisdom, the right type of statement, the right type of methodology that's non-Western. It's not the traditional type of mediation course that you learn, to be the appropriate way of doing things today. And the final chapter where I surveyed the case studies is chapter 5. And here I transitioned from historical accounts of rabbis that served as third parties to customs and traditions within different Jewish communities around the world, where lay people, well-respected community leaders, serving as the third-party peacemaker. And what's fascinating to me is that whether we're talking about 12th century Spain or 19th, 18th century Morocco, there are commonalities between them, which is that they're always serving in groups. You never find one mediator of peace, one mitavech shalom, or one rodef shalom, pursuer of peace. They're always working together. They're always being proactive in entering into the conflict. They don't wait for somebody to invite them in. This is part of the ethos of collective community engagement. And they're helping the parties both reconcile the relationships and also bring about an actual problem with a compromise, an actual solution with a compromise agreement. That's a very important theme that I try to emphasize throughout the book. Are we talking about reconciling and shifting perceptions, or are we talking about solving problems and bringing about solutions? And the combination of the two and the balance between those two is a common thread that goes throughout the whole book. So that is just a quick overview of the different chapters. I want to slow down for a moment and look at two case studies that honestly, I don't think I ever really had a chance to teach them over. They didn't become part of the school programming. They're not part of generally the academic lectures that I give at university. But I think that tonight, anyone who's following the political realities of Israel, well, you'll see if these things connect or resonate to what's going on. So I want to talk about two stories that both of them take place. Both of them can be found in the same medieval text of in Babylonia, 10th century Babylonia, written by Rabbi Natan the Babylonian. The first story is found in my chapter on rabbis, at the very end of the chapter of rabbis, chapter 4, and it's about Rabbi Nisi al-Naharwani. How many of you have heard of Rabbi Nisi? Okay. By the way, part of my agenda is some of these great peacemaker heroes, I want them to get higher up in the rankings of well-known rabbis. Okay. So who is Rabbi Nisi? Rabbi Nisi, as the story is told, he's a well-respected rabbi, not the most influential, but he's pretty well respected. The author notes that he's also blind, okay? And what's the story? The story is that there's a terrible political conflict going on between the two political leaders of the Babylonian autonomous Jewish community of the 10th century. Kohen Tzedek Gaon on the one hand, and the Reish Galuta, or the head of the political leader, David ben Zakkai. I'm not going to get into the whole story right now. You can read the book, read the footnotes for the historical context, but here's the bottom line. 3 years, there's no government, okay? There is no government for 3 years because these two leaders cannot sit together. And all the attempts of everyone to mediate don't work, because you'll have to read the story of why they hate each other. But I'm interested in the intervention. Who is the person that can actually shift the dynamic? Who's the person that can connect to both of these parties and make a real sustainable peace agreement? And that's Rav Nisi. Rav Nisi, it tells a story that he would be entering in between them, trying to make peace for years. This isn't working. And then one night, he went and opened all the locks in Babylonia and pronouncing aloud the ineffable name of God, the name of, right? He opened 4 other versions, 14 locks, until he arrived at Kohen Tzedek's home and stood above him. He found Kohen Tzedek studying in the middle of the night. Imagine the scene, okay? I am we can kind of imagine now, because we're all sort of in our own studies. I am physically in my study. I am sitting and learning, and I got a whole bunch of locks. I have the lock of my office. I have the lock of my door, of my house, the lock of the building. And all of a sudden, not in the Zoom, in the room, in the middle of the night, comes Rav Nisi just appearing in my room. And he's shocked. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And Rav Nisi says to him, "By your life, sir, I opened 14 locks in order to arrive at your home." And Koig said to him, "What do you want? What do you want now?" And Nisi replied, "That you bless the exilarch David ben Zakkai and make him the leader over you." And then he replied that he would do so as Nisi had said. What happened here? And then the story goes on and describes how they have a whole reconciliation process and everyone lives and gets along. What about this story helped transition a gridlock of politics into an actual agreement that they could move forward and build trust? That's the question. Who is it and what did he do? So Rav Nisi here, he's clearly connected to both sides, but that wasn't enough. Okay. What's interesting here, as opposed to, let's say, when I discussed Aaron, he's not more respected than the two parties in conflict. They are literally the two most powerful people in the community. So there isn't a third party that's more respected that can kind of call them in. But Rav Nisi takes his weakness, takes his disadvantage, and uses it as an advantage. That's how I want to argue what's happening. He does a couple of things. First, the element of surprise, the element of showing that he has these kind of magical powers. He's using magic. So one lesson is we might need some magic to get out of the stuck situation we're in right now. Okay? But he's using the name of God to literally and symbolically unlock the doors of where one of the sides is hiding, engaged in his study, disconnected from the other side, disconnected from the fact that the society is not functioning because the two of them aren't talking. And his ability to enter into that door and using God's name as a very religious type of power, but at the same time, he's not a political threat to them. He's not a political threat because it says later by the author that because of the fact that he was blind in that time period, he could not be a candidate to be one of those political positions. And he knew that, and they knew that. So therefore, because he wasn't having his own political interests, they could trust him as somebody that was going to be able to step in. But his element of being able to unlock the doors that they're hiding in order to have that element of surprise and then shift the dynamics is part of the brilliance, the wisdom that he did as a last resort after they had been stuck for a few years in order to bring about a resolution to the conflict. The other story that I want to share, as I mentioned, is also from the same literature as it's from the same time period, the 10th century Babylonia. Another political conflict, okay? This time including both David ben Zakkai, who I just mentioned, and another great rabbi that appears on the scene, Rabbi Sadia Gaon, very famous rabbi. And this is in the end of my chapter about lay leaders, not rabbis, but also lay leaders need to sometimes be the ones who step in and serve as the peacemakers, not only the role of a religious leader. Most of the time, the lay leaders are anonymous. They don't say who they are, okay? But in this particular case, this leader, this Bishar ben Aaron, is mentioned. So here, the story of Bishar ben Aaron is that there's been a conflict about 7 years between these two political leaders, these two religious and political leaders. And again, you have the same situation, that they are not talking with each other, and that they each have actually appointed one is the Rosh Yeshiva, he's the religious leader, the other one's the political leader. And the two of them are supposed to kind of lead the community together. And each of them had actually appointed a proxy replacement of the other. So you have two Rosh Yeshivas, two Rosh Galutas, and they're not functioning. To make a long story short, okay, it gets to a point where it actually gets violent. There's actually a moment where someone gets beat up, and then the community gets involved. This is critical. Who eventually starts the process? Here the story says that everyone gathered before Bishar ben Aaron. Everyone shows up at Bishar ben Aaron's house and says, Bishar, you're the only one who's connected to these two entrenched political leaders, religious and political leaders. You've got to create a process to move us forward. Bishar takes it upon himself. I'm not going to read the whole story, but basically takes it upon himself, and he meets with each side separately. And it describes what he says to them and describes what they say back to him. And then he says, you know, we have to stop extending this mahloket, this dispute, this stalemate. And then he goes and he says to the other side exactly what he said to the first side. Very similar to those of you who are familiar with the legend of Aaron. Here you see this happening in practice. In practice, meaning the way it was imagined by the author of this story. But what's interesting to me here is the process of what he does after he goes back in this shuttle diplomacy meeting with each side separately. He has both leaders with their whole entourage come to his huge home. Now you have to imagine this reality that he's got this, like, you know, palace that has different homes within it. So each one is staying in a different home within this larger palace. And it says, and both houses were in the courtyard of this Bishar, who went between them with words of peace. And then men from among the heads of the community arose and divided into two groups. One group held the hands of the Axilarch, and the other held the hands of Rabbi Sadia. And one group came forward from one side, and the other group came from the other side, until they met each other, they kissed each other and embraced each other. And this took place on the fast of Esther, the day before the festive of Purim. And then he says to them, so they have this whole sulha, this whole reconciliation process. And then he says to them, it's not enough. You hugged and embraced in person. Now you have to stay at the other one's home. You have to stay at what somebody is going to be invited to the other one's home. And then he says, you know how we're going to decide? We're going to cast lots. Those of you who are familiar with the story of Esther knows the symbolic meaning of casting lots, right? And they cast lots, and it turns out that Rav Saadia will stay at David ben Zakkai's home for the next 2 nights, and they'll continue to feast and eat and schmooze and socialize and be together and normalize their relationships. And after those 2 days, on the third day, it says, and he left happily and in good spirits. That's a reconciliation process. But that is not to the exclusion that you need to actually solve the structural problems of the conflict. There is still a question of the political aspect of this, of the resources aspect. There's an actual conflict that needs to also be mediated. And again, I won't go into detail, but it says also how they worked out the compromise agreement. What's so important here is that sometimes peacemaking efforts will only focus on one or the other. They'll focus only on, can we get the sides to a political agreement? An agreement that both sides sign a contract, and then afterwards they'll work on reconciling their relationships. And there are others that are going to be investing. We can't solve political issues. We can't solve, bring parties to a mediation where they're going to have a compromise. Let's have a reconciliation. Let's have building relationships. And what's fascinating to me is learning case study of sometimes the reconciliation must be there in order for them to get to a compromise agreement. And there are other cases where they first have to have an agreement, that solves all the justice issues, that solves the resource issues, and then they start to build the relationship. These are not just stories of the past. These are important models and maps forward for what are we trying to do? How do we actually implement this in practice in terms of solving issues? And when I think about this, I'm not only talking about in the larger context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, okay, or also, but in interpersonal relationships or on community levels. Do we try to build trust and build a relationship and then work on the structural aspects? Do we try to work on the structural aspects and then build personal relationship? These are some of the bigger questions that will be constantly coming up. And again, constantly trying to think about what are the implications of how do you apply this in reality. But also what comes out of this story of Bishr ben Aaron is that you have the creativity of integrating the reconciliation process with a familiar ceremony, with the Purim festival, with them having Purim Suda, the Purim festive meal together, that they're reading the text together. That's all part of expanding the identity to be a shared common identity instead of an identity of conflict. How do we also today create, sustain creative models that are familiar enough, that are authentic, but yet are also forward thinking, that they actually help build relationships? I think about the fact just the other night that I went with my wife and son to an iftar event of friends. Not a huge event, just two of the sheikhs that we work with at Mosaica. What is the meaning when you have a rabbi and a sheikh and their families just sitting and socializing? Not a deeply religious event, but there is a religious aspect to it. It's eating, but there's a religious aspect. Those are all part of how to do reconciliation and build trust and build relationship. And also, as I said, be thinking of practical solutions to solving problems. So those are just two of the of the case studies. What will it take to solve the problems of the gridlock in the Israeli political situation? I'll let you figure that out on your own time. But I want to share just two more texts as a conclusion, then I'll hand it over to Rob for questions. I end the book with the conclusion chapter, what I call the text, theory, practice, and scope of third-party peacemakers in Judaism. And here I try to do a conceptualization of what can be learned from all the different case studies, comparing, contrasting, who is the third party, what are the different methods that they're using. But the point that I want to emphasize right now is the question of scope, the question of who is this between? And this is a question that is at the core of the conversation of religious peace building. Is this all an internal Jewish conversation? Is it just an internal interpersonal conversation? Can it also serve in terms of larger intergroup conflicts? And I relate to that question by ending with a quote by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the great rabbis of at the destruction of the temple, who says that the person who makes peace between fellow individuals, between husband and wife, between city and city, between nation and nation, between family and family, between government and government, there shall not come upon him any harm. And I love this text because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai himself was, as some commentaries see him, as some historians see him, was an attempted, tried to make peace with Rome. And he knows what it means that sometimes when you're doing that, you can come into harm's way. He was almost killed for trying to make peace with Rome in the midst of the revolt. But what's also interesting here is the scope. Who are we trying to make peace between, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? And he notes it's between individuals. Check. Okay. Families, husband and wife, amazing, very important. And those are most of the case studies are dealing with that I write about. But he also expands it to include nation, government, and government. You can't get any more expansive than that in terms of larger group. What's interesting is that 1,000 years later, the biblical commentary Rashi, when he requotes this text in his commentary on Exodus, he omits the end of it. He says a peacemaker should be between individuals, husband and wife, families, and he takes out nation, government. And the commentary on Rashi, Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, he writes, it makes sense, because when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lived, it was relevant for a Jew to try to make peace between governments, because they had a degree of autonomy. They had an army at a time of revolt, and they're talking about actual cessation of violence between different large groups. In Rashi's time period, writes Rav Chaim Hershenson, where there only is the Jewish community. They have no ability to make peace between government, nation. And that, I think, raises the question for today. We have tons of texts that talk about interpersonal, intracommunal third-party peacemaking. The question is, can these texts, and to what extent can they encourage individuals knowing how to mediate their conflicts, communities their conflicts today, but also on larger scale conflicts that are posed to the Jewish people today. And I conclude, the last quote is by a Moroccan rabbi who says, I would literally sell the clothing off my back, he says. I would give away all the possessions of the world if I could fulfill what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai just said, is between making peace between the governments and between the nations of the world. And I'll give a shout out that for Mosaica here, that when we went through a process of a new mission statement of Mosaica, those of you who know Mosaica know that it has two parts. There's a part that's focused on professional mediation that works with individuals and families and communities all over Israel, right? Through, whether it be through the 48 centers that Mosaica supports, or all the other work. And then we also have the Religious Peace Initiative with Rabbi Malkior and all of our partners in the Muslim world that are doing large scale mediation, insider mediation, as we call it, between religious groups, and doing very practical things of trying to mitigate crisis situation. And when I was thinking about what could be a mission statement that conceptualizes all this work, I immediately thought of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that it's between individuals, families, communities, cultures, and religions. And that, I think, is really what I'm trying to emphasize in this book. It's about, first and foremost, individuals. What kind of people are we? How are we relating to our loved ones? How are we relating to our neighbors, to our family, our community? But can we also expand? It is not to start with the largest conflicts, but it's also not to end with only our individuals. It's constantly asking and teasing the question of how do we apply this in different contexts. So the final word I'll say before I again hand over to Rob is cover, okay, which is always the hardest decision. You finish writing the book, and then Oxford says, well, what do you want to do as your image for the cover? And that was a huge dilemma, because what am I going to do? Put a picture of Aaron, put a picture of the Chidah. What could capture it? And if you look very carefully, you will see that there is Hebrew text in the background of the cover. And that is this text right here. This is a quote from Rabbi Chaim Falagi, who was a great rabbinic authority about a couple hundred years ago in Turkey. And Rabbi Chaim Falagi wrote a text that I'll paraphrase, and I'll explain why it's on the cover. Rabbi Chaim Falagi writes in what he calls Tzava Chaim, which is kind of a living will, he calls it. And he says that he prays that one day, the Jewish community would have a Chavura Kedusha, a holy committee, which would be of Rotfei Shalom, of third-party peacemakers. And he says that these peacemakers would be able to go ahead and mediate conflicts as soon as conflicts arise between individuals or between larger scale community, between groups, between communities. And they would dedicate all their efforts for peace. And they'll have to take an oath. They have to take a special kind of bond that they are going to take upon themselves to be a Rodef Shalom, to be an actual pursuer of peace. And he says that if they do that, they have to be extremely patient and careful to not engage in conflict themselves. Because if they're known to be a very, hot-headed, conflictual person, when they show up at your door and they want to mediate the conflict, well, they're not going to be inspiration and they're not going to be a role model. And then he concludes and he says, this won't even cost that much money, he says, and there's no need to spend money on all this, except for a community official who will be responsible for gathering these Rodfei Shalom together. So when I wrote about this in chapter 5 about the role of lay leaders serving as peacemakers. And here you see a rabbi who's saying, I don't need to be the peacemaker. I don't need to be the mediator. Not everything has to come to the religious leader. How do you create a culture of peace? How do you create a culture of mediation, of problem solving? And his call to have these kind of community leaders step up and do that just the way they do other community functions, whether it be, escorting people when they pass away, or raising money for charity or other things. There also has to be an institution called the Mediation Center. And Mosaica, as I mentioned, which supports and works with the network of community and dialogue mediation centers around the country. That's literally what this is happening. This is sort of his dream, his vision come true. So when I read that, I turned to my good friend, Micha Celia, who happens to be a Sofer Stam, writes Torahs as a hobby on the side. And I said, we need to write this just like the Hippocratic Oath. I want this written up as a text, as the text of what does it mean to be a third-party mediator, and write it. And so it's in the middle, like a Torah scroll, but right in the middle of the page because it's a third party. And we're going to give this to rabbis as they get trained. So they hang it up in their office, okay? And have that as inspiration that this is what they need to be doing. And we gave that out to rabbis at the large mediation conference that we had before Corona. So when I thought about which cover to use, I felt like there couldn't be a better message to sum up the whole essence of the book of text, theory, and practice than that image of a call for people to be a third-party peacemaker within their own community. So with that, I'm going to conclude. And maybe I'll just say, before I hand it over, Rob, is the book is actually available online. Don't want to forget about that. I'm assuming it was shared in the chat. You get, because you came to this Zoom and you've stayed with me for now, you get the 30% off. And I will also say, I am looking very much forward to the second part of this series, again, of my friend and colleague, Rabbi Chaim Kaminsky, who's going to talk about his book next Tuesday, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, about fundamentals of Jewish conflict resolution. No, it's not the same thing, because mine is focused on the mediators, focused on the third party. He's focused on when you don't have a third party and I'm a side in the conflict, then what do you do? So I'm going to take off my PowerPoint and open it up and hand it back to Rob.
Thank you, Daniel. That was just fantastic. I have to say, we've studied together, we've shared a lot of ideas, but I just love the way you conceptualized that. Folks, here's how I want to handle the Q&A. I would like you to use the chat box, because that way we have a large enough crowd here where it's going to be hard for me to determine who was first and who was second if you just press, the little hand thing. So what you can do is put your question in that chat box, or if you would like to ask your question in person, just say, I have a question, and then I will call on you. Okay, so I'll just go in the order of the chat box and either read the question, or if you want to ask the question yourself, because it's a little more involved, feel free to do that. Now, I see immediately here that Erica Brown, who's going to be part of the next session here, asks, how do we all get a copy of the tzava'ah that you displayed? Are they for sale?
These?
Yeah.
This?
I think that's what Erica was referring to. Her question popped up when you were saying
that's a great question. Yeah. I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. Maybe we'll have a way that you can get it on the new Mosaica website when it goes up, that people can be able to get access to that.
I think it's a wonderful idea. Okay, and we have Catherine Wolin, who asks, when is lay leader training to become an when is lay leader training to become an advocate? An advocate. Catherine, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you want to? You can write it again, or you can clarify, or you can speak up. Catherine? Okay, well, look, Catherine, if we'll come back to you if you'd like to, oh, a peacemaker, sorry. When is lay leader training? Are you asking, Catherine, whether there's going to be a kind of a lay, whether Daniel is involved in training lay people for this kind of work? That's what I'm gathering from your question. Am I correct in my interpretation of your question?
We could interpret it in a couple different ways.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have to wait for further clarification. Okay, and then
the answer is yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so Daniel, the lay community is interested in this. So,
Look,
what do you have to offer them?
I think what's important here is that you don't need to be a professional mediator. I think that's one of the most important things that I feel should come through in the book. It's that anybody that's in interaction with other people, they are in a position to be that insider third party. It's not the professional third party that we're talking about. So therefore, any lay leader, any lay person that's in a community situation, they can either continue to sustain a conflict, and sometimes that's important, or sometimes they can help in trying to transition it to become a more constructive outcome. But really, we're talking about a culture. These people that got involved in mediating the conflicts, again, it's not because they were trained, and they weren't always the ones, like Rabbi Falaji had said, that was like their position. It's because they were connected to both parties. So when people are connected to people that are of difference of opinion, that are from different groups, they can serve as that third party. One of the greatest concerns that I have of what's facing Israeli society and American society, many societies right now, is the erosion of the third party lay person. That doesn't mean that you're neutral. It doesn't mean you don't have a position. It doesn't mean you have a political opinion. It means, am I in relationship with people that have difference of opinion? And can the two of us work together and try to have the other one understand and then solve problems? So yes, it's very important, the role of lay leaders, the role of community, but it doesn't mean that you have to go ahead and get it's great, take a mediation course. And as I said, Mosaica trains, and there's lots of trainings of lay people to become mediators, but sometimes it's just about who you are in your own position, in stepping into that role.
Wonderful. Okay, next up, I think we have Mish. You're next.
Daniel, thank you. That was beautiful. And I just want to say that I had an opportunity to read some of the book, and I also enjoyed every page, so I can't endorse it enough for everyone who's here still sitting on the fence. I'm interested in hearing, you did just a beautiful skira of a lot of sources. I'm interested in hearing how how your learning in Jewish text has influenced your work in practice of trying to mediate. How is it different as a result of having learned in advance?
Meaning, how does this actually influence practice?
Yeah, for you.
Look, it's three things come to mind. First, some of these texts become a mantra. It's like you're in a crazy situation and you're like, well, if the Chidah could spend 8 months stuck in that community trying to bring the two parties together, like, how are we not going to invest this energy of one meeting, another meeting, another meeting, another? So sometimes to me, it's the role modeling that I think that you see. It's It's some of the text, as I was starting to say, the mantra when it says you have to go, you have to be, even if it means going from city to city, from country to country, you have to be pursuing peace. So, you're schlepping all over the place. We had one trip, without saying where we went, that took 26 hours when it should, because it was during Corona. I'm not going to say where we went, but you're saying, what the heck am I spending my time spending 26 hours on something that should just be a couple hours flight? And then you have these texts pop in as a religious motivation for being hopeful, for not giving up. There's a lot of reasons when you're dealing, whether it be family conflicts or, goodness, the conflicts in our region, to give up. And I think if one thing that trainings of skills don't give you is why. And this book hopefully is also trying to serve the why, and inspiration, that it's a deep tradition, it's a deep call, and there are lots of heroes that invested their time in doing it, and we're supposed to kind of learn from them. Plus, it really helps when you bring out the right quote from a rabbi. So when I'm talking to like somebody who's kind of coming from, let's say, Iraqi background, I'm like, hey, did you know that rabbi did that awesome story? And you're like, cool. And you're talking to a Hasidic rabbi and you pull out that story. So each one you have to know which story to bring out. That's another thing that's been very helpful to me.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat box. Why don't we just give it a couple? Okay, we do have somebody. Sarit Amsalam, Dr. Roth and Company, thank you for your riveting words. A mediation culture is a notion close to the heart, meaning mediation more than a process. Do you want to react to that, Daniel?
Was that a comment or is that a thing? Was that a question?
I think it's a comment.
Oh, it was a comment. Okay.
Unless, Sarit, you want to ask a question as well, but how do you further assimilate it during our mediation process?
I'm going to take that as the way I'm going to choose to understand it. I think one of the things that was really interesting journey for me is integrating, I would say, contemporary, modern, Western models with traditional models. And I think that's kind of one of the interesting things in practice right now, which is when we want to try to create a mediation course for rabbis today in Israel. Okay, how do we integrate some of the wisdom and the text of the past and make it also infused with the amazing wisdom of skills and problem solving methodologies that are there today? Do you integrate it? And perhaps even this book has also been very important to me in terms of our work with working in the Arab sector in Israeli society, that we have about 7 initiatives or community mediation dialogue centers in the Arab sector of Israeli society right now, that Mosaica is trying to help them flourish and grow, that are connected to the municipalities. How do you connect religious leaders in the Muslim world, in the traditional world, to contemporary mediation? And one of the things that this book was very helpful in my own research and now trying to do this is, okay, let's conceptualize what are the traditional ways that of sulha, of how rabbis were doing this, which are not so different, and what are some of the more contemporary ways, and how can these two bodies of wisdom be integrated to make something that is both familiar and traditional, and yet progressive and forward thinking in doing something that we haven't done before. Exactly how to integrate those two worlds is still part of the experiment that we're working on in practice. But for me, that first chapter of Muhammad to Sulha was very, very important. And I use that a lot in the trainings and the conversations that we have in practice today.
Okay, we move on. Let's see. I think the next person here, Adam Berner, asked, would like to hear what kind of work you are doing in the field? Is it between observant and non-observant Jew and Arab? Very interesting. It's something I actually wondered about, particularly about given the situation and the increasing tensions between Haredi and non-Haredi and the rest of the Israeli public. that's an excellent question. But also you can also address the Jew and Arab issue, which is, these
Yeah,
are
thank you, Adam. Thank
huge
you.
issues.
Yeah, I mean, what's been again, sticking kind of to the book, what's been sort of fun about writing this book, especially as I was transitioning into Mosaica, is that Mosaica deals with literally every different type of conflict that's going on in the country. We don't deal directly so much with the ultra-Orthodox, although we did, right before Corona, we were going to be doing cultural sensitivity training for the Israeli police about the Temple Mount in Al-Aqsa, and about the ultra-Orthodox, how the police are engaging with the ultra-Orthodox. It wasn't exactly a mediation process, but cultural sensitivity came in there. But my work really has been focused now on working with rabbis within their communities. Adam, I know that's something you've done in America for many years. How to have rabbis become professional rabbis, and for them to learn a couple of these texts, to know that's always been part of the mandate of a rabbi, to be able to also mediate between the different factions and the different interests and identity groups within your community. So we do a lot of that, and as I mentioned, is trying to connect where it's most difficult, and where I've invested my energies is where it's most difficult is really between Islamic leaders and Jewish leaders that are often not amongst the moderates. We try to only work where it's been deemed as impossible. And if you build the right relationship and you build local religious leaders to then serve as mediators, not professional mediators, but they're serving as religious leaders, as mediators, that they build a trust, that they understand what's going on with the other one. And then if the two of them work in the same community together, they can solve a tremendous amount of problems. And that's, again, it's something that's kind of familiar, because that's what you find in these rabbinic texts. That's what that Arab leaders do within their community. Can they work together and do that? Not always so simple to get them to do that, but when they do, it's incredible. The Haredi community, yeah, that's a hard one. I don't address that so much in my book.
Okay, and then we have Mark Kleinman. It says, I think Rabbi Bob Kaplan and his applications to developing diverse community partnerships. How much does Mosaica apply these skills in that arena?
So those of you who are from Mosaica are now smiling, because we've had Bob come over a couple times and do trainings, and apply some of his methodologies. We've developed our own methodologies of how to do this, based upon years of experience. And what's been fun for me is kind of taking these texts in theory, and as Rabbi Malkior said to me earlier today, he said, well, now you get to take these texts and theories and actually try them out in practice and see what works and what doesn't work. So yes, it's Bob is an important contribution to the field.
All right, and then we have Michelle, who asks, is gender a significant factor in mediation? How are women different peacemakers than men? I think that's a
Thank you, Michelle. It's a really great question. It was a big frustration to not find a lot of cases of women, and there's a lot of reasons for that, as I noted quickly. In traditional societies, to this day, if you go to the sulha process, the Arab model of peacemaking, women are not going to be the ones who are part of the jahad. They're not going to be the ones who are part of that delegation that's going back and meeting with each side and bringing them to a peace agreement. But what you do find is that women play a very critical role, often behind the scenes, often in the whispering at night. There's some fantastic studies that until I had started reading about the role women play in these peacemaking processes, I didn't even know to find them in rabbinic literature. Meaning the two that I did find, I wouldn't have actually counted them initially, because it wasn't traditional mediation. They're not the ones in the forefront of having religious leaders meet with each other. But when I started reading the literature about the role women are playing, which is very significant, you'll hear stories like the men will go home, they'll talk to their wives, they'll come back the next day and they have a totally different position for the negotiation. Everyone knows that night in the kitchen, they got a really good shouting at, and then they're going to be shifting in their approach. So is that influence? Yes. Is that in the public sphere? No. And that's why it won't be documented as much. So I wish I could have found more stories that articulate the way women are able to do that. But the combination of the text being written by men and the fact that women are behind the scenes just didn't allow that. I pray that the book be an inspiration for people to go and do more research about it. Obviously, it's very important to engage and include women in any type of process, because that's part of the communities working together. And certainly in Israeli society that we are engaging in Mosaica, out of the 1,200 community mediators, I'm certain that 70–80% of them are women. A lot of them are women that are engaged in this. In terms of the higher, kind of more delicate work of religious leaders, a bit more challenging of a space for women to sometimes step into and be the mediators, at least in our region.
All right, the next question, I got a direct message from Reverend Bradley Long. Reverend Long, would you like you want to ask this question directly, I presume?
Go ahead, Bradley.
Yes, great, thanks. It's been fantastic to hear you again for your presentation. Wonderful. I'm just a little bit interested in the application of these texts across the sort of spectrum of the Jewish community, maybe from sort of ultra-Orthodox religious and moving towards more Reformed traditions. What's the response been? Is it more towards the kind of more Orthodox side, or is it fairly equally weighted?
So I had the cutoff date of mid-19th century. So the last text is meaning that probably the latest text that I addressed was mid-19th century, and I really stuck to the traditional Orthodox world in terms of how they were doing that. So I don't think there's any story or text that I wrote about that you couldn't go to the most ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Israel and quote it, and they'll be like, yes, that's authoritative. Actually, really, I think when my first day or two working at Mosaica, we were there was a meeting at a forum, and I was sitting next to a very well-respected ultra-Orthodox judge, and he asked me, what do you do? I barely knew what to describe about Mosaica because I just started. So I said, I just wrote a book about the Chidah. So he said, oh, because I knew that he was somebody who would have been interested. Then he immediately started telling me stories. It just telling him that just opened up a whole world of trust, So yeah, all the stories that I write about are really ones that I think would be seen as paradigmatic and important precedents for across the Jewish spectrum today.
All right, we have a number of comments in the chat box which people should look at, but I'm not going to necessarily read out loud. For instance, Elon Bass wants to connect with other people interested in conflict resolution and mediation, and he gives his LinkedIn address there. So please take a look at that if you're interested in connecting with him. And then let's see, Gary Schaffer. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Any modern case studies where you incorporated the traditional models and processes into current mediation?
Yes, that's literally what I constantly write about. Meaning I will try to take the different traditional models and then think about how that applies in practice. And again, I'm going to emphasize the word that, here, you can hold me to it. Please God, my next book, Rabbi Melchior will be laughing and saying, you don't have time to write a book. But we're always writing a book. Every day we're writing a book because we're constantly doing work. But the next book that will be written one day will be about the role of insider mediators in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is Rabbi Melchior. This language of insider mediator, I can't emphasize it enough, because when you have communities deeply entrenched in conflict, having an outsider, whether it be a diplomat or an outside professional mediator, and say, I'm going to come in for a few hours, I'm going to bring you guys into a professional process, maybe get you to an agreement, handshake, and then I'm going to exit. That doesn't really work. And I think part of the wisdom that's both ancient and yet kind of, wow, what a new idea is, how do you get the people that are really connected to the communities, that have the keys of the narrative of how they're being interpreted, if they're in conversation with each other, as the work that we do of having top Islamic leaders and top rabbinic leaders work and figure out how they can build deep trust and then solve problems, that is directly a continuation of the line of what I'm writing in the book about traditional ways of third-party mediation, third-party peacemaking. It's not the outside professional third party. It's the inside rabbi who's connected to those communities. Rabbi Nisi was connected to those two parties. He wasn't a professional. Bishar ben Aaron was connected deeply to those two parties. So constantly taking those type of method, which are ancient wisdoms, and applying that into contemporary context is exactly what I try to address in the book.
Okay, we have a few more minutes, and I'll tell you what I'd like to do, Daniel. I'm gonna, why don't we take, I think there are about 2 or 3 more. Why don't we take them all at once? And you should maybe write down. Gary Mason just wanted you to say a little bit more about our conversations around religion, that they're not there to dominate, but to allow for meaningful relationships. And then let's see. Larry
Gary is the one who taught me the word insider mediation, so he gets credit on that.
And then Larry Mandel is wishing that there could be a digital version of this. I guess
there is a digital version.
There is a digital version. Okay,
yes, that's available.
Okay, and let's see. Erica Brown writes and asks, people handle conflicts in their home, work, and family lives differently. Interesting. Do you discuss these various arenas and where people can manage their emotions most successfully to achieve better mediation outcomes? And then finally, this will be the last one that I think we'll be able to take. David Dishon, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. David, you wanted to ask a question directly, and then Daniel will quickly wrap this up. David, do you want to ask your question?
David, it's a beshtek. Wait, David, you're on.
Okay, here we go. So first of all, it was a real pleasure to hear the presentation, Daniel. Very inspiring, very exciting. Big yasher koach. I know in many of the traditional sources, there are conflicts between attempt to conflict resolution and speaking the truth. Now, we have sayings of how the truth has to bend itself in order to achieve peace. But maybe you could speak a little bit about what are the limitations on this? Are there limitations? What might they be?
Okay, Danny, why don't you try to handle those 2 or 3 last comments / questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll just say, Erica, yes, there's tons of literature about family and different things, but I wasn't writing about different contexts of conflict. I was really interested in the third party and how they're operating. So I'm not sure I share a whole bunch of wisdom about family versus other contexts. But I'm gonna use my minute to talk about to address David's question. I have a lot that I wrote about changing the truth for the sake of peace. That can only really happen when you're in these traditional settings, by the way, because in Western mediation, you're often trying to bring everyone together in a group. Everyone's constantly together. But in diplomacy or in traditional mediation, you're constantly meeting with each side separately. So you're going to want to say certain things just in the right way that the other one's going to agree to meet. And now we found ourselves in these dilemmas. And I remember the very first time sitting in Rabbi Malkior's house, and all of a sudden we have something. I just started laughing to myself. I said, well, how are we going to tell this to the other side, this and that? So these things come up. That's not lying. The Talmud says, lishanot, it's just changing in order to reframe it. So the other side will be able to hear it. But with saying that, and maybe this will be my last point, I think one of the most important texts that I always promise my students I'll mention in every course is the Rofeh Oman, the expert doctor. That in Hasidic literature, they take Aaron, who lied, and in order to make peace, and they say Aaron was a professional. He was an expert doctor. A lay person, an amateur, tries to get into that work, doesn't know the medical history, doesn't understand how to do that intervention, whether it be that lie, that white lie, or using sometimes a certain forceful behavior that they talk about. If you do that, you can kill the patient. The wrong, thinking that that's a brilliant intervention, you don't know what you're doing, you could cause a lot of damage getting involved. But if you know your patients really well, writes the Hasidic literature, this is in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, and you're really an expert at it, then that one little trick could be the one that creates a whole bunch of healing and a whole bunch of fixing the situation. So what I always try to encourage all my students is that there isn't one solution for every single context. Really, you have to have an arsenal of a whole bunch of different types of tools and a bunch of different types of texts that you'll know how to understand the theories to apply them right into practice. A lot of people take a 60-hour mediation course. That's great. But if you try to apply that in every single case, that's like taking first aid and then thinking that you're an expert doctor. And in order to really understand, we have to understand the theories, we have to understand the texts that give inspiration, and then also engage in this in practice. And it's a call for people to engage in this in practice on the individual level, on the family and the community, and of course in the larger conflicts that seem to be impossible but are possible to make peace. So Toda Rabba, I'm really touched to see so many familiar faces from different times and new faces, and thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Mish, and hope you'll be able to read the book.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I urge everyone to read the book. It's a wonderful piece of work. So to reiterate what we said earlier, our next talk is going to be on May the 11th, Tuesday, May the 11th, at the same time of day. It's going to be given by Howard Kaminsky, who will be speaking about his book, Fundamentals of Jewish Conflict Resolution, Traditional Jewish Perspectives on Resolving Interpersonal Conflicts. This too is a wonderful book in the field. I'm familiar with it. This should be a great talk. Howard will be speaking about his book in dialogue with Erica Brown, my colleague at GW. And so if you haven't registered yet for this event, please do. And I hope to see, I will certainly be there. I hope to see you, see all of you there again. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe. Kol tuv, shalom. Take care.